Well, it's a great pleasure to pay a visit to the American University, and on that visit, which is my first, to deliver the Hurst Lecture. Professor Durfee warned me that I should not be speaking to a professional audience, for many non-philosophers would be here, and not to a popular audience, for the philosophers would be here, no doubt grinding their teeth and their axes for my imminent dismemberment. What was I to do? I am afraid that the dead center between those extremes would fall in no man's land. So, wishing to hold a few auditors to the end, I have decided to offer you a shameless melange of shop talk and autobiography, recommending that the philosophers take their rest while I reminisce, and that the others have pleasant dreams while I philosophize. May I begin, then, on a note of personal reminiscence, if I promise not to stay on it. I have lived long enough now to have seen both sides of the great divide formed by the First World War. And what I should like to do is to compare what is happening in some sectors of the world of mind with what was happening then. I shall talk chiefly about what's happening in philosophy, since I know a little about that and not much about anything else. My conclusion, I may as well confess at once, is a somewhat somber one. Our advance in the control of nature has been immense. But whereas in those remote days before the deluge, reflective men seem to be converging toward a consensus regarding standards in thinking, feeling, and conduct, the two great wars destroyed this movement, and what we have now is something like chaos in all these fields. The standard toward which the old world was groping is what I venture to describe as the principle of sanity in thought, feeling, and purpose. We have lost it. We are looking for a replacement. We haven't found it yet. Perhaps if we take our bearings, it will help us to get on the road again. That's the substance of what I have to say. Now a word about that old world that to most of you must be less even than a memory. As I look back on it, it seems curiously static, as if fixed in amber and bathed in a gentle afternoon sun. Not that it felt like that to be in it, and no doubt the glow that it now carries is in part merely the illusion that memory always throws over the past. But it's not wholly that, I think. At any rate, for those of us who are academics, it had an intellectual serenity and stability that seemed to have disappeared. The philosophers and scientists of those days had their problems, plenty of them, and they knew they had a long way to go. But they were fairly confident that they were on the right track and only had to remain on it to reach their goal. There was a broad, straight road leading into the future. In philosophy, in morals, even in criticism, something like a majority view was in the making. Let me recall to your mind first what was happening in philosophy. The time just before the First War was a rationalistic heyday. There is a picture extant of James on his New Hampshire farm wagging a finger at Royce and saying, "Damn the absolute." But Royce is smiling serenely, as well he might, for he knew that the pundits of philosophy were on his side, and that James, with his pragmatism, was looked on as a maverick and an amateur. In Europe, the story was similar. There, Bergson was the maverick, and the German system builders dominated the scene. When, as a wandering student, traveling, of course, without a passport, I went to Berlin in the winter of 1913, it was Paulsen I wanted to hear. And though when I asked the porter at the gate where Herr Paulsen was lecturing, the answer was, "Ach, ist tot, ist tot," I found that Wundt was still lecturing at Leipzig and Windelband at Heidelberg, and I went to hear them both. They were, of course, tremendous scholars, but they were more than that. Even a naive youngster could feel in them, as their floor-stamping students did, a passion for rational order, a passion for articulating in intelligible fashion the great mass of erudition that their historical and social studies had accumulated, a conviction that however dense the difficulties, reason could drive a Roman road through them if it would. Across the Channel in England, James Ward was still lecturing at Cambridge, and Bradley at Oxford was still brooding in his rooms overlooking the Christchurch meadows. I sought them both out, as only a brash young American would, and being a student at Bradley's College of Merton, with rooms a few steps away, I had an excuse for seeing something of him. It is hard to convey to persons of another generation what an aura his name carried in those days. He never appeared at meetings. He never lectured or taught. Many of the philosophy dons at Oxford had never so much as seen him, but they were all aware of him and afraid of him. There was a sort of electric field around the den where the old lion was holed up. He was formidable not only because he wielded a slashing dialectic and a stabbing pen, but also because he was in such deadly earnest about his philosophy. It was his religion and his life. Bradley's conception of philosophy was the dominant one in his time, but in essence it was not new. It had come with some flourishes from Plato, Spinoza, and Hegel. The business of philosophy was to understand the world. And understanding means placing things in a system, at first in a little one, as when a child grasps the function of the chain on his bicycle, later in a larger one, as when he sees why democracy must place limits on freedom, ultimately in a complete one, in which nothing is left out. Thought is an activity governed by an immanent end. That end has two aspects. One of these is completeness, the embracing of all things within our knowledge. The other is order, the grasp of that logical interdependence which all things have on each other if the world is really intelligible. This view made provincialism in philosophy almost a contradiction in terms. To test any piece of your knowledge, you had to go beyond it. Then beyond that wider context to one still wider, like the ripples from a pebble dropped in a pool. Certainty lay at the end of an infinite expansion. Common sense, science, and philosophy are merely stages in one continuous effort of understanding, which is an effort to make everything intelligible through seeing its place in the system of things. The man who suffers from an intellectual cyst, that is, from any belief which resists criticism from his experience as a whole, is in that degree less than sane. When we start talking with a man in an institution, he may seem a very sensible fellow until he suddenly remarks, "I'm afraid I must set you right on one matter. You see, I'm really Napoleon." You may point out to him 1,000 things that are inconsistent with his conviction. It's to no purpose, and if you corner him, he may be dangerous. His insanity lies in a loss of perspective regarding one of his beliefs. He's not wholly irrational, but neither is any of us rational altogether. Sanity, rationality, is a matter of degree. Now, Bradley's philosophy made sanity, in this large sense, the end and criterion in the sphere of thought. There was a sense in which the ethics of those days was an attempt to introduce the same idea into the sphere of practice. In ethics, Bradley and Green were neo-Aristotelians. For them, the end of the practical life was the balanced realization of one's powers. In his masterly book, The Rational Good, that great but too neglected sociologist Hobhouse took the same view. The fulfillment of any drive or urge of human nature is pro tanto good. It is to be repressed only when its fulfillment, by inhibiting other fulfillments, would mean less fulfillment on the whole. Thus Hobhouse brought into ethics a principle that corresponded to Bradley's principle in knowledge, what I have called the principle of sanity. The aim of thought was at breadth and harmony of judgment. The aim of practice was at breadth and harmony among impulses. Fanaticism, arbitrariness, self-will, asceticism, the repression of any impulse or any man, except in the interest of fuller expression on the whole, was ruled out as unreasonable. Mens sana in corpore sano was the ideal for both the individual and the body politic. A similar view was developing in aesthetics. A widespread interest in the theory of criticism was an inheritance from Victorian days. When I made my first comment on the world with no language but a cry, the author of that phrase, Tennyson, was the most admired of poets, and Matthew Arnold, then only 4 years dead, was the most influential critic. Arnold detested willfulness and triviality in literature and was sure that an objective better and worse existed, whether he succeeded in finding it or not. The anthropologists were beginning to remind us, as Chesterton noted, that the wildest dreams of Kew are the facts of Kathmandu, the crimes of Clapham chased in Martaban. And Kipling chimed in with the artistic parallel, there are 59 ways of constructing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. The Victorians and Edwardians, of course, didn't believe that morals were merely a matter of taste, and they didn't want to believe that matters of taste were either, if that meant de gustibus non disputandum, and that one lay or lyric or landscape was as good as another. Croce, indeed, whose voice was weighty in those days, argued that what counted in art was not content but solely expression, but this aroused vigorous protest. Bosanquet, who had written a history of aesthetic, presented an indignant refutation of it to the British Academy. Andrew Bradley, the philosopher's brother, who was professor of poetry at Oxford, raised the issue in one of his lectures by asking whether one could write as great a poem on a pinhead as on the fall of man, and concluded that one could not. The Anglo-Saxon tradition has never, until very recently, run to the narrower forms of art for art's sake. Ruskin thought that art should express all man's aspirations. Arnold felt as strongly as Eliot does that a poet should write with the whole Western tradition in his blood. The poets of the Victorian era were spokesmen of their age. Tennyson, for example, in In Memoriam, had voiced the misgivings of faith about science. Browning was considered a philosophical and religious teacher. When Bosanquet gave his Gifford lectures shortly before the war, he urged that the principle of individuality, which was just Bradley's principle of breadth and harmony again, was a measure of goodness and beauty as well as truth. Art itself was subject to the principle of sanity. Well, this was the sort of doctrine we were brought up on in those antediluvian days. Perhaps we were a little intoxicated by it, for it inclined us to think of history as a triumphant advance of reason in which freedom broadened slowly down from precedent to precedent and would go on doing so. We were brutally awakened from our dream. Suddenly all the dams of civilization seemed to break at once. I was a bit of flotsam caught by the flood in Germany and washed up a few weeks later on British shores. Britain was, of course, tragically unprepared, and I remember wondering how those ragged squads drilling in London squares could meet the massed professionals across the Channel. The universities sent their young men in shoals into French trenches, from which the best of them did not return. There was a moratorium on speculative philosophy. It seemed remote now, and people did not fail to remark that it had been made in Germany. Royce in America died denouncing the Germany at whose feet he had sat so long. In England, Hobhouse dedicated a book to his lost son in which he bitterly attacked Bosanquet's theory of the state. The distinguished idealist Haldane, who had reorganized Britain's army for her, was excluded from the cabinet by the pressure of public opinion. When the universities reconvened after the war, the old philosophy was on the wane, and new voices began to be heard. A strange and novel gospel entitled Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, arranged in numbered verses and prophesying the end of philosophy as heretofore conceived, appeared in Cambridge in 1922. The same gospel, translated now into intelligible English by a young man in his 20s named Ayer, appeared some years later in Oxford under the title Language, Truth, and Logic. As the chairs in philosophy fell vacant, they were filled by a new breed of men. There is not, I think, one chair in England, Scotland, or Wales, and there are very few in this country, still occupied by men of the older persuasion. One wonders if there has ever been so swift a revolution in philosophy. On the continent also something like a revolution has occurred, though here the Jacobins were not analysts, but existentialists. I began by saying that I had seen both sides of a divide in the history of philosophy. I now want to look at the hither side of it through glasses I brought with me from the further side, and could never quite get myself to discard. There is no time at the moment to test these glasses for their amount of distortion, but I must remind you that I am wearing glasses, and that they certainly do distort in some measure, and that you would do well to check what I say through your younger and unspectacled eyes. Let us look successively then at the philosophy, the ethics, and the criticism that seem now to be in the ascendant. The philosophy that is dispossessed, that of Green and Bradley, Ward and McTaggart, at least in its old haunts, is linguistic analysis. It came to general notice a year or two ago when it was attacked in the columns of the London Times by Lord Russell and vigorously defended by its Oxford supporters. That it is of interest also to Americans is shown by the fact that the New Yorker allowed an article on it by a young Indian, Ved Mehta, to trickle along through 100 pages of advertisements. Any philosophy to which the New Yorker will devote 100 pages has arrived. What is this new philosophy trying to tell us? Unfortunately, that's very hard to say, since its advocates are averse to stating in general terms what they are doing. Others have to do this for them. If I had to put the new philosophy briefly, I should say that it is an attempt to read G.E. Moore in terms of the later Wittgenstein. Let me try to explain. In 1926, Moore, in a state of reaction against metaphysics, wrote a famous essay called A Defense of Common Sense. In that essay, he took the view that common sense was the test of philosophy, rather than the other way around. Philosophers have often titillated their hearers by doubting the existence of space, time, matter, other selves, and their own past, and while doing so have covered much paper spread out in space before them, have taken many hours by clock time to do it, have written with solidly material pens, have kept in mind throughout the prejudices of their readers, which their readers would undoubtedly show, and have relied on their untrustworthy memory as to what these prejudices were. Moore thought there was something queer about this. He was far more certain, he said, that the things that the philosophers were doubting were true than that any of the arguments they offered against these things were sound. Does not that clearly show that common sense and not philosophy is the court of last appeal? He thought it did. The linguistic philosophers accepted this argument of Moore's, but they considered that he had not quite understood what made it so strong. It was hardly plausible to say that the plain man was somehow a philosopher who could outthink the professionals at their own game. The strength of common sense lay rather in its language. Language has so developed as to fit like a glove the vast variety of our experiences. In its ordinary uses, it expresses or reports experiences we have all had at first hand, and such reports it is idle to deny. To tell the plain man that there are no material things is to tell him that the phrase material thing has no correct application, and this is absurd. For all he needs to do to refute it is what Moore did before an amused, if also bemused, British Academy, namely to raise his two hands and say, "Here, these are examples of what I mean by material things, so of course they exist." Can the philosopher really mean to deny this? If he does, we can only tell him to his moon-like face that he is talking nonsense. It is more charitable to surmise that he is really proposing to use old words in a new way, which, having no authority in accepted usage, is just a queer way. When Berkeley denied the existence of matter, he was not trying to banish what you and I mean by tables and chairs. He was proposing to use the word for something invisible and intangible. You philosophy students know that means Locke's theory of matter, of material substance, which he could then proceed to deny. This was permissible, but somewhat silly. Once we see the strength of ordinary usage, we can also see the weakness of traditional philosophy. If philosophic problems arise just because we've been tempted into misusing words, then we should deal with them not by trying to solve them, which would be taking them too seriously, but by a sort of Freudian therapy, by seeing how they arose and thus dissolving them. Philosophers, when they've left the straight road of common usage, have proved amazingly gullible. The whole Platonic philosophy, for example, is based on a sheer verbal confusion. Plato saw that the members of a class were alike. This suggested that they had something in common, as a class of students have when they have the same teacher. This common something was named by a noun, and since nouns usually name things, it was taken as a thing. Thus universals came to be regarded as existence. But there are no such existence. There are only things resembling each other. With this simple insight, the Platonic world of universals, of ideas taken as things, comes tumbling down like London Bridge. Now there is much more, of course, in linguistic philosophy than this thesis about ordinary usage, but this remains its most distinctive thesis. What is one to say about it who has been brought up in the older tradition of philosophy? It's sometimes thought to be a return to common sense. I must confess that the only common sense that seems to me authoritative in philosophy is that massive common sense which consists in the attempt to see things steadily and whole, and which I have described as philosophic sanity. Judged by this sort of common sense, that of the linguistic philosophers is a wraith that melts away when looked at. For one thing, the notion that ordinary use will lead us straight seems to me a myth. Anyone who believes it must, as Russell points out, abandon his belief in physics. The plain man gazes up at the night sky and sees a nova, or exploding star. He says, "Look, something is happening to that star." What he means by this impeccable English is that something is happening to it now. This cannot be right if the physicist is right in saying that it's not happening, that the event he thinks he is seeing was over, perhaps years ago. Again, it's perfectly good usage to say that in the next room there is a table not now observed by anyone that is brown, smooth, and hard. Berkeley would say that this is not so, and whether one agrees with him or not, I do in fact, he is surely not to be refuted by saying that he is confused about words. He knew what the plain man meant, and he declined to accept it, saying he must think with the learned, even while speaking with the vulgar. Secondly, to confine philosophy to the sort of question to which ordinary meanings supply the answer is to impose a crippling censorship on our thought. I've heard an eminent linguistic philosopher settle the question of free will by saying that the statement, "I can push this inkstand," is good usage. It therefore has a clear application. I therefore can push the inkstand, which means that I am free to push it. Now, if "can" means here, as he took it to mean, merely that I am not prevented from doing it by any external restraint, the statement is true enough. But then it has nothing whatever to do with the real issue of free will, which the plain man has probably never thought of. That issue is not whether his volition would produce its normal effect, but whether there is any cause constraining his choice. And to rule this problem out, because it does not use free in the ordinary sense, is mere obscurantism. Thirdly, is it true that philosophical problems arise out of verbal confusions? Some of them no doubt do. But some that are alleged to have done so have surely not done so in fact. It is hard to believe that Plato or any other self-critical mind has been so hypnotized by nouns as to think they had to stand for substantives. And whoever says that men owe to verbal confusions their long wrestling with the problems whether God exists and is good, whether thought and feeling survive death, whether there's a trustworthy test for right conduct, whether beliefs are made true by good consequences, seems to me not to have entered into these problems at all. Philosophy springs straight out of human life, out of such longings as Descartes' for certainty, or Spinoza's for a better way to live, or even Bradley's for a way of experiencing deity. As the great philosophers have conceived it, even as it has been conceived by those few, such as Hume and Moore, whom the linguistic sect admires, it called for breadth of sympathy and understanding. One can extract from metaphysics or theology a set of verbal puzzles if one wants to, but it's a kind of mental myopia to insist that this is all there is to them, a myopia of which minds governed by the principle of sanity would, I suspect, have been incapable. We've already suggested that philosophy after the war came to a fork in the road. British philosophy, followed largely by American, took the road of analysis. European philosophy took that of existentialism. What is existentialism? It's a reaction against what it conceives as an excessive reliance on reason. But apart from this and such minor statements as that all existentialists tend to be gloomy and to write badly, it is hard to say anything that holds of all of them alike. Some of them are atheists like Sartre, some of them theists like Marcel, some of them like Heidegger have offered Heils to Hitler, others like Sartre, 3 cheers for Stalin. For some of them, the dominant mood seems to be anxiety, for others, nausea. It is unsafe to talk in general terms about a movement as amorphous as this, so let us focus our brief comment on the Father Abraham of the tribe, that great Dane, Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard's chief influence in this country has been on religious thinking. So I'll say nothing about him except a few words on his religious view. His views have been appropriated with showers of blessing by theologians in need of a philosophical imprimatur. He was brought up in a household where theological discussion was the order of the day, and by a father to whom revealed religion was the most tremendous of realities. After living for a long time in a hothouse, young Kierkegaard went to Berlin and studied Hegel. He became a skeptic, but soon returned to his father and the sunless religion of the big dark house in Copenhagen. But no one comes back from Hegel quite the same. Kierkegaard saw that if the men of faith were to save their faith from Hegel, if they were to stay his new conquering empire of light and reason, They must make a complete break with reason. Otherwise, the rationalists would use the paradoxes of religion as a Trojan horse to invade and destroy it. There's no use in fighting fire with fire. Better fight it with water. Quench reason with faith. Admit frankly that faith is as full of paradoxes and contradictions as the critics say it is, and then answer that it does not in the least matter. That on the level where faith moves, the laws of logic and ethics are transcended. That to demand intelligibility in religion is impious, an attempt to imprison deity in the little cage of our own understanding. This doctrine has become epidemic in our theological schools, which shows that there is something in it answering to a need. Faith is threatened again by reason, this time not by Hegel, but by the rising tide of scientific knowledge, which is secularizing the world. But do we have here a satisfactory defense of faith? I think, that Kierkegaard is so popular nowadays because men like Niebuhr and Brunner and Barth have found in his kind of philosophy the cue which they can use for a refutation, or a meeting at any rate, of the popular rationalism of the day, which is scientific. Do we have here a satisfactory defense of faith? I cannot think so, for it carries too much that is inimical to both faith and knowledge. It undermines knowledge because if the contradictions in which Kierkegaard revels can really be true, then logic itself is no safe guide. And if logic goes, then nothing can be depended on in the whole range of our knowledge. If what reason warrants as true is invalid in theology, then reason as such is a false guide. The doctrine is likely also to be fatal to faith. For if faith can tell us, as it did to Abraham, in that legend so beloved of Kierkegaard, precisely because it rebukes our moral certainties, that what conscience and reason condemn may nevertheless be our duty, then how are we to distinguish the inspiration of the prophet from that of the fanatic and the charlatan? Reason may be a poor thing, but it's the best thing we have, and the theology that discards it may live to rue its recklessness. If it succeeds in persuading men that their reason and their religion are really in conflict with each other, there can be little doubt which in the long run will come out second best. It will not be reason. We have been remarking on new developments in philosophy and theology. Has anything important been happening meanwhile in the field of ethics? 50 years ago, moralists, as I suggested, seemed to be converging toward a rough consensus. There was an objective and universal standard for conduct. Actions were to be appraised through their consequences, and what was important among these consequences was the fulfillment of human faculty. At any rate, Paulson in Germany, Hobhouse and Bradley in Britain, and Dewey in America were so far in tune, though each with grace notes of his own. Hobhouse's panorama of morals and evolution showed the advance of morals as a steady increase in the control and ordering of impulse by reason. And he thought that the advance showed an accelerating speed. But storms were brewing, as he wrote. Since then, there have been at least 4 major waves of calamity for this old position, which have all but overwhelmed it and its high hopes. The first of these, like logical positivism, was stirred up in Vienna. A courageous student of the oddities of human behavior named Freud, trying to explain such things as slips of the tongue, dreams, and sudden rages, concluded that to explain them plausibly, we must push the boundaries of mind far down into the unconscious. The more he probed into this sub-cellar of the mind, the more convinced he became that this was the essential part of it, that it was filled with unruly denizens, and that the respectable dwellers upstairs were scarcely more than puppets of the unruly mob below. Our attempts to justify our conduct rationally are less reasons than rationalizations, that is, self-deceptions designed to make this submerged crew, what this submerged crew wants us to do, look like what we ought to do. Just below the polished floor on which the chairman of the Board of Deacons walks about in such seemly fashion lies a set of cavemen held in precarious check. To many, this theory itself seemed to be a product of irrational misanthropy. But then came the second and most terrible of the waves, a double and tidal wave of 2 world wars, and they invested the caveman theory with a horrible plausibility. We had read of Attila and Genghis Khan, but these monsters seemed buried safely in the Dark Ages. We never anticipated their resurrection in the Himmlers and Eichmanns of the most scholarly nation in Europe. Nor was the moral breakdown confined to these men and their henchmen. In talking recently with a woman who had escaped a concentration camp, you may know her, Hannah Arendt I'm thinking about, I learned what I had not quite realized before, that for much of their worst work the jailers could rely upon volunteers among the prisoners themselves, who for a bit of extra food or more tolerable quarters were ready to sell out their comrades. Some of these were apparently kindly people who broke sickeningly under the strain. Many of us must have asked ourselves whether we or any of our respectable kind were quite safe against the atavism of the Neanderthal id within us. A third, though milder, wave of dismay was stirred up by the anthropologists. Boas, Malinowski, and Westermarck collected an immense mass of facts, appearing to show that in no major relation between human beings, between parent and child, for example, or man and woman, was there any stable or common pattern of conduct. Popular books by Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead were soon disseminating the notion that right and wrong were relative to cultures, and that talk of objective standards in ethics was naive and provincial. Many youths who had served in France or Japan or the South Seas were able to verify this variability for themselves. In our sociology departments, the relativity of morals became almost a truism. Few of these anthropologists were trained philosophers, and for a time it was easy to answer that they were going beyond their brief, that no description of what is can settle the question of what ought to be. But here came the fourth wave, which supplied the anthropologists with support from an unexpected quarter. It was the rise of a subtle philosophical school which undertook to offer proof that objective standards were meaningless. According to this new school, the statement that something was good or some action right was not strictly a statement at all. It was an exclamation, an expression of feeling, a cry of attraction or repulsion, like cheers or shame, was therefore called sometimes the boo-hurrah theory. If anyone did so exclaim, you could hardly say, yes, quite so, for in what he had said there was nothing true or false. Furthermore, an exclamation can be neither argued for nor refuted. All value judgments were thus removed at one stroke from the sphere of the rational. The old idea that the good life was the rational life, or indeed that any conduct was more righteous or more rational than any other, was a pleasing but rather self-righteous illusion. Lord Russell, who was converted to this way of thinking in middle life, confessed that he didn't like it, but that he added that the alternative theories were less convincing still. Well, what are we to say of this massive drift toward ethical skepticism? One cannot dismiss these theories as merely false, for there is truth in each of them. Nevertheless, I must confess that they seem to me, one and all, to be at odds with what I have called the principle of sanity in thought. They were all generalizations from too narrow a base, which when worked out into their implications collapse into incoherence. Many people think of Freud as the great anti-Aristotle who has shown that man is an irrational animal, and some of them are carrying over into philosophy Freud's method in religion. Just as the plain man's belief in God is a father substitute, Bradley's belief in an absolute is a passionate reaching out for security. Even the idealism of the happy and healthy Berkeley arose out of infantile abnormalities connected with sex and excretion. And indeed it would appear that all theorizing is governed by non-rational pulls and pushes. Now, no one can really hold this consistently. No one supposes that beliefs in mathematics and physics are the puppets of passion. We know that even in psychology some men can stick to the evidence better than others. We know that unless they did, Freud, who is clearly one of them, would have no claim to be heard. It has often been pointed out that if all theory is the product of non-rational desires, then so is the Freudian theory, and in that case, why should we believe it? The Freudian who believes his belief that men are irrational to have been arrived at rationally is rejecting his own theory, for he believes that we can so far be rational after all. And then have we not returned to Plato and Bosanquet with their heartening insistence that men are rational, though imperfectly and brokenly so. Is not this the answer also to talk about war revealing the caveman in us all? Many men did break with their ideals and principles under the terrific strain of war, but some did not. One thinks, for example, of the heroic German pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But what if it were proved that under physical duress we all have our breaking point? What would that prove? Not surely that we are cavemen in disguise, but rather that our powers of normal thought and feeling are conditioned by our frail bodies, and we knew that tragic fact before. To say that a man is really or essentially what he is under extremes of misery or pain is to write him down unfairly. May I confess that I remain skeptical too, not of the facts that the anthropologists have supplied us, but of the conclusions commonly drawn from these facts. What they show is that men differ widely, if you will, wildly, in their moral practices. They do not show, I suspect, that men are fundamentally different in their moral standards, because that would mean a fundamental difference in their scale of intrinsic values, and this seems not to have been made out. To show that the Aztecs resorted to human sacrifice is not to show that they approved of murder, or that their ends in life were basically different from ours. It may only show that they lived under religious delusions. If we held the unhappy belief that only by placating an angry deity with an annual sacrifice could the crops be raised on which the lives of all of us depended, is it so certain that we should act differently ourselves? When one comes to ends instead of means, the great intrinsic goods to which life is directed, do we not find that men agree fairly closely the world over? We have yet to come on any corner of the Sahara or Antarctica where men prefer pain to pleasure, ignorance of the world to knowledge of it, fear to security, filth and ugliness to beauty, hatred to friendship, privation to food and drink and comfort. So far as one can see, the Russians and the Chinese want very much what we do. We differ from them not fundamentally about ends, but practically about the most effective means of reaching them. Indeed, behind the bitterest debates in the United Nations about colonialism and injustice, you find this very assumption that the needs and goods of human nature are everywhere the same. That is what makes the debate possible. We can argue about the means because we agree about the ends. The have-nots of the world are saying in chorus, what we want is what you want and largely have. Now help us to get it too. But according to our emotivist colleagues, it makes no sense to talk about what is objectively good or good for all men. To say that anything is good is to express how I feel about it. When Mr. Zorin and Mr. Stevenson both say that oppression in Angola is bad, they're expressing no common belief. And when Mr. Zorin says that Russian control in Hungary is good, and Mr. Stevenson that it is bad, they're not differing in belief. Such judgments are exclamations. Now, this, I'm convinced, is the sort of theory that would have occurred only to a philosopher, and can be retained only by the philosophers described by Broad as clever sillies. I do not think it can be consistently believed or lived by. It implies, for example, not only that we never agree or differ in opinion on a moral issue, but also that we never make a mistake on any such issue, that nothing in the past was either good or bad when it occurred, that objective progress is meaningless, that no one can show by an evidence that any moral position is sound, or even adduce any relevant evidence for it, that approval is never more appropriate than the opposite, since there's nothing good or bad in the object at all, that personal or national differences over moral issues are incapable even in theory of a rational solution. I cannot stay to argue these points much as I should like to. I can only say that I do not think that Russell or Ayer or Carnap has dealt with him at all convincingly, and that until someone does, I shall continue to believe that there are objective moral standards binding on all men and open to study by a common reason. May I turn now to the last field mentioned at the outset, that of criticism. Those of us who began our work before the flood had hopes that even in such treacherous fields as music and painting and poetry, some sort of standard of judgment was emerging. Not that we wanted all artists to be alike, which would be a bleak consummation even east of the Berlin Wall, but that there might be some consensus as to what made a work of art worthwhile. Need I say that in this field the confusion is worse confounded, if that is possible, than in the field of ethics? What has happened? What has happened is the gradual extrusion of meaning from art as something aesthetically irrelevant. I'd like to talk about painting, perhaps because I know so little about it, but take poetry, for instance. There stands out in my memory a remark made to me by the head of a large publishing firm in London. My firm will look at any sort of manuscript except a book of poetry. In that, he thought the public no longer had any interest. To be sure, that was some 10 years ago, and since then an exception seems to have occurred. John Betjeman has scored a remarkable success, at least in Britain, so far as number of readers goes. The greatest success, it is said, since Byron. Betjeman is no great poet, but this makes his success the more significant. He must have something that the public is hungry for. What this is, in part at least, seems clear. He believes that verse should sing and that it should communicate. Most poets of recent decades appear to have abandoned the effort after these ends. The result is that they stammer to each other in corners, out of earshot of the public. I think that here again we find a failure in sanity. But sanity has to do with the intellect, it may be said, and what has poetry to do with that? A.E. Haussmann said that poetry need have no meaning at all, and that his own test of it was whether, if he repeated it while shaving, he tended to cut himself. His examples of meaningless verse are not perhaps very convincing. But in any case, he says, for example, that Shakespeare's great lyric, "Take, oh, take those lips away, that so sweetly were forsworn," he says that's completely meaningless. I don't think it is. But in any case, intelligence in art may show itself in more than one way. It may show itself, for example, in the grasp of what is essential to a given art as distinct from what is eccentric in it. Now music lies so near the heart of poetry that its loss is crippling and its deliberate forfeiture stupid. A well-wrought rhythm has an almost physical appeal to us, whether it's the rhythm of a marching band, which William Lyon Phelps confessed made him drop everything and go off in pursuit, or the somewhat similar drum beat of Macaulay's lays, or the more delicate measure of one of Haussmann's own lyrics. The appeal of this recurrent beat is connected in some obscure way with the very throbbing of our pulse. Having something organic about it, the perfect marriage of sound and sense is usually achieved not by contrivance, but by a welling up from unconscious deeps. Haussmann has reported of one of his poems that the first two stanzas came to him on a walk on Hampstead Heath. The first came with a little coaxing after tea. The fourth required 13 deliberate rewritings scattered over a year. The conscious superego in these matters cannot replace the dynamic id, but it can supply the blue pencil. It can cultivate the sort of conscience that makes for craftsmanship. Now, the trouble with contemporary poetry, if I may go out on a limb, is that its superego has gone AWOL. This has left its practitioners without an ear, and therefore without much music in their souls. Many present-day poems, if printed continuously rather than in lines, would give the impression of being peculiarly cacophonous prose. Robert Frost has written some things that sing. Masefield has written more, but these men belong to an earlier day. The last poet I can think of whose work is uniformly the product of a fastidious ear was Haussmann himself, who died in 1936. Listen to this little thing, for example. With rue my heart is laden, for golden friends I had, for many a rose-lipped maiden, and many a light-foot lad. By brooks too broad for leaping, the light-foot boys are laid. The rose-lipped girls are sleeping in fields where roses fade. Only a master of the music of speech could have been that simple. Where among us today is the craftsman who could do even that? Not only is it sure in its music, it's intelligible. No one could fail to catch its meaning at once. The reader of much contemporary verse feels rather like Carlyle, who, when listening to the talk of Coleridge, thanked heaven for occasional sunny islets of the blessed and the intelligible. As F.L. Lucas has said, it's like a hardening of the arteries in an aging society that poetry should today have lost touch with the ordinary man, and the ordinary man with poetry. Having heard a bit of Haussmann, would you now please listen to this, contributed to one of our most reputable monthlies by one of our most celebrated poets. I'll stop after each line, because you might not know otherwise where the line stopped. I said to my witball, he, lidwise, half-hoodwinked gel, shuttered low, keep out what rain falls, of hindsights or foresights would, rankle root, house, guts, goods, me, but my eye was a sot, in a bowl of acids must lid lift to know, and hail rips had entry and whirled at us, inlet is sea at our cellars, racks the drag in tow. Now, my impulse to murmur at this is neither very moving nor very luminous, is checked by my memory of having heard a distinguished critic assert that there is an advantage in leaving it uncertain what a poem is about. Since it gives the reader his freedom, he can take it as Romeo to Juliet on the balcony or a portrait of the artist as a young man. Now when I hear this sort of thing, I also hear what W.K. Clifford called a still, small voice that murmurs fiddlesticks. There is more in poetry than a gnarled vocabulary plus Freudian free association. At that rate, anyone can write poetry, which means that poetry has lost its standards. It seems to me about as easy to hoax the critics in verse as it is in painting. Indeed, it has been done over and over again. We've all heard of the two Australian soldiers, Lieutenant Macaulay and Corporal Stewart, who decided to test this matter. They decided one afternoon to invent a new poet named Ern Malley and amused themselves by making a volume of poetry out of tag ends of phrase, some of them thought up by themselves, some culled from the books around them. For example, a U.S. government report on the drainage of breeding grounds for mosquitoes. The only principle, they said, governing the selection was that no two consecutive lines would make sense. When the book appeared, a leading Australian literary magazine, in a review of 30 pages, said that it, quote, worked through a disciplined and restrained kind of statement into the deepest wells of human experience, unquote. And an American literary quarterly praised it as showing, quote, an unerring feeling for language, unquote. The Wesleyan University Press has just published a most amusing account of how Witter Binner and Arthur Davison Ficke invented a whole new school of poetry. They wrote a set of 44 nonsense poems and had them printed in a book called Spectra by two new poets named Anne Knish and Emmanuel Morgan. Edgar Lee Masters wrote that spectrism was, quote, at the core of things, and imagism at the surface, unquote. John Gould Fletcher praised the spectrist's, quote, vividly memorable lines, unquote. Eunice Tietjens wrote of the book, quote, it is a real delight, unquote. Harriet Monroe accepted some of Emmanuel Morgan's poems for publication in her magazine Poetry. Alfred Kraimborg devoted an issue of his critical magazine Others to the new spectral school. Binner and Ficke had some 18 months of laughter before they revealed that the book and the school were one great spoof. In 1940, the novelist James Norman Hall thought he too would go into the poetry business and published in Muscatine, Iowa, a book called O Millersville by a certain Fern Gravel. Shortly afterward, the New York Times was saying, we have found... The Times said, we have found the lost Sappho of Iowa. And the grave Boston Transcript intoned, quote, the book is amazing, amusing, full of the human scene, and not to be missed, because there can't be another like it in the world. After 6 years, Hall told the whole story in the Atlantic in an article, Fern Gravel, a hoax and a confession. Well, poetry, no more than art or theology, can surrender itself to meaninglessness without capitulating at the same time to charlatans. Perhaps Arnold asked too much of it when he said that it should be a criticism of life, for poetry is not philosophy. But after all, it can hold ideas, even great ideas, in solution. Most enduring poetry has been an implicit criticism of life, and most men can absorb such criticism more easily from the poets than from the bleak logic of the philosophers. It was Sophocles, not Socrates, of whom the memorable remark was made that he saw life steadily and saw it whole. Though the Canterbury Tales are really tales, and Macbeth and Lear are only plays, and Gray's Elegy only a lament in a country churchyard, it is hard to see how anyone could read them responsibly and not be wiser and better for it. They talk of ageless things, love and ambition and joy and death, which are central in every life, and they do so in a way that makes us accept them with more understanding and reconciliation. Sanity is not the special preserve of eggheads. Indeed, it is apt to elude them and to grant itself to those who engage the world more generously. There is a sanity among values, just as there is a sanity among beliefs, and it lies in the power of bringing a broad experience to bear on each particular point as it arises. It is not cleverness, but wisdom, and the wisdom not of the serpent, but of Solomon. It does not run to verbal conceits or adventures in punctuation or poems that are acrostics. As John Morley said, you cannot make a platitude into a profundity by dressing it up as a conundrum. Well, what a tirade this has been. It has sounded, I'm afraid, like the Jeremiad of an irredeemable old fogey. It's not quite that, though things are now changing at such a pace that we are all likely to be fogies if we are granted a normal span of life. These recent decades have been impetuously hurrying years in which we have come a tremendous distance. When I look back to the other side of the divide and recall that in those days a touch of pneumonia or tuberculosis or erysipelas might be a death warrant, that the men who worked in mines or on railroads did 10 or 12 hours a day, that there were few automobiles and no planes, that in the lonely farmhouses there were no radios or television sets to keep them in touch with the world, and that the housewife's necessities of today, electric refrigerators and washers and vacuum cleaners, were all but unknown, I recognize has been trotting along behind it, breathless and a little bewildered. It has lost confidence in reason, and with that its sense of direction and of relative importance. It has lost those standards of sanity that keep the rational mind on course and enable it to tell excellence from eccentricity, distinction from caprice. 100 years from now, men will look back with wonder at eminent philosophers insisting that the business of philosophy is with linguistic usage, at eminent theologians pronouncing reliance on reason to be sin, at eminent moralists reducing moral judgments to boos and hurrahs, at eminent psychologists refusing to call Greek culture better than Polynesian, at eminent artists straining after the meaningless, of eminent poets flocking to the cult of unintelligibility. But the human mind, after all, is something of a gyroscope and tends in time to right itself, and its past gives us some idea of what righting itself would mean. The main tradition in philosophy is one that runs down from Plato through Hegel to Whitehead, a tradition that has stood for system and sweep of vision, and it will come back. The main tradition in ethics is one that has run from Aristotle through Spinoza to Butler and Green and Bradley. It, too, will come back. There's a great tradition in criticism that has run from Longinus through Goethe to Arnold, and it is best Eliot. Surely that will revive. These traditions are not really dead, they're only sleeping. And this shrill shout of mine is an attempt not so much to wake them up as to make them toss in their sleep and perhaps even dream.
A couple of minutes to change over the tape.
Oh, right. Shall I take? Oh, it's 9:25.
Dr. Blanchard has agreed to answer some questions until 9:45. It is now 9:25. So there must be thousands of them from
Correction, please. Try to answer questions. Yes.
Professor, as a philosophy student, it's never been my impression that reading philosophy was either easy or that philosophy had been written for the man in the street, usually. Now, what I would like to ask is this. If that is so about philosophy, why should it be that it seems to me that you are considering poetry as something that should be able to be understood by the man in the street in a very easy manner? What I would like to ask is this. Why can we not ask of a reader of poetry the same kind of effort and concentration that we ask of the reader of philosophy?
Excellent question. Well, I'd say that philosophy and poetry are very unlike each other. It seems to me unreasonable to ask the man in the street to follow Hegel or even Herbert Spencer. And I think he might have a little difficulty with Berkeley, who is the finest writer of philosophy in the English language. But I do think that while philosophy is something that, since it is an attempt to think through by abstract concepts the ultimate nature of things, it would be unreasonable to ask the philosopher to be intelligible to him who runs. It isn't unreasonable to ask the poet to be intelligible. Look back over the past of poetry, and what do you find of the great poets? Was Homer a person who had to be read with a lexicon and to be read over and over in order to be grasped? Why, no. Dante spoke from the very heart of the Italian people and was intelligible to them and loved by them. Shakespeare was all things to all men. Tennyson, I said, spoke for and to his time. Poetry, after all, is an expression of ideas immersed in feeling. And the fact that the ideas are steeped in feeling should render them more easily intelligible. Poetry speaks to the man as a whole, not to his abstract intelligence. Now, if a person wants to write a poem that is an acrostic, and by, say, 8 or 10 readings of it, I can see that it contains a meaning, and then when I read it, I find that meaning is conveyed deeply and musically into my mind, then I'm ready to acclaim him while being a little dubious about his technique. I hope you won't think I'm just dropping a name when I say that when I was at Merton College, Oxford, one of the students who were studying philosophy under the same tutor with me, and of whom therefore I saw a good deal, was T.S. Eliot. In those days, Mr. Eliot was engrossed in Principia Mathematica. On a vacation with him, I don't remember that he read anything else. He just read it morning, noon, and night. Some of Mr. Eliot's poems remind me that he was reading Principia Mathematica in those days. I think Mr. Eliot is a very considerable poet and a still more considerable critic. But I do feel, when I read the 4 quartets, that I'd get a lot more out of it if it weren't buried so deep. Even The Wasteland, which I think is a great poem, ought not to have a glossary and a set of footnotes for grasping it. I wonder whether we, now let's see. Who's your favorite poet? May I ask you?
Yes, I was just going to ask you something else about him too.
Oh.
I was going to ask you about the author of Hamlet. Now, you mentioned Shakespeare as a person who seemed to be speaking to the common man as well as to the intelligentsia.
Yeah.
But I would like to ask you, do you think that the reason Hamlet seems to be so difficult to us is the fact that it was written in the 16th century and not now? Why is it that it seems to be necessary to read it many times, at least as many times as we read
Another good question. I suppose it's because, I suppose in some measure it is due to the fact that between Elizabethan and contemporary English, a great gulf is fixed. I've been reading Lear lately, and I'm especially struck by it in Lear. Shakespeare didn't speak the language of the present ordinary man. But if you find Hamlet difficult, and I suppose it really is difficult, it isn't because Shakespeare was making gratuitous difficulty by the knottiness, the crypticness of his language. The language, I think, is economically suited to convey both the ideas and feelings into our minds. It's rather that you get Hamlet or Lear at different depths. everybody can get something. I mean, I suppose the plain man, when he hears Hamlet for the first time, gets something from him, but he doesn't get what Kittredge would get from him, and so on. Well, that's a fascinating question you've raised, but perhaps I ought not to go on about it. Are there, Professor Krikorian? Now I do tremble.
Well, I think you're a kind of lyric, reflective mood is quite moving in relation to the past, but I feel you have done some injustice to modern movements in the sense that we are more perceptive of the irrational.
Yes.
And we can never go back to the rational system you are suggesting. I mean, we have to integrate the irrational emphasized by Bergson, by pragmatists, by anthropologists and whatnot, and this merely to consider them as objections or detriments seems to me is a loss rather than a gain. I think we have to get something very worthwhile in this philosophy. So at the end we may get into some system, but
Yes.
the system has to be quite different than the earlier periods after Freud, after pragmatism, and I think it would be unfortunate to consider all these contemporary movements as sort of something to be discarded rather than to be integrated into some fuller philosophical system.
Yes. Well, I think that's a good correction. I suppose there are two comments that I'd be inclined to make on it. While I think Professor Krikorian is perfectly right that we'll fail to get human nature in perspective unless we see with full clearness the irrational elements at work in it. Still, and while it's also true that we're not living in the 18th century, which was the century of rational illusions, I certainly agree with Mr. Krikorian that we wouldn't want to go back to the 18th century and somehow assume that all men were rational. No. At the same time, I do think that particularly in art, and perhaps also in theology, we have carried our attention to and engrossment with the irrational to an unconscionable extreme. I don't believe in the least that Karl Barth is right, that the only true religious experience is one that is disconnected from our natural reason and our natural conscience and represents a discontinuous descent of divinity through a sort of pipe into our nature. And I'm inclined to think that among our writers of fiction, of whom I must honestly profess too great an ignorance, I think it's unfortunate that the emphasis has been on the irrational side of human nature. It's just recently occurring to me to think of the people who have got Nobel Prizes in literature from in the United States. Now, of course, those are the people whom the world reads. Everybody knows of the Nobel Prize. And when these people write about America, they assume that being Nobel Prizemen, being great men of letters, they're communicating a picture that has some significance and truth. Well, Sinclair Lewis, I've never met Elmer Gantry. I'm not even sure I've met Babbitt. Faulkner, well, how many Yoknapatawpha counties are there in the United States? The Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck, our last Nobel Prize winner, well, the Grapes of Wrath is welcomed with enthusiasm behind the curtain, because it's supposed to give a picture of what Americans are like, these poor Okies. Pearl Buck, well, she's an altogether different. Her vein is different. I don't know whether she's greater or less great, but at any rate, she can't be accused of doing what I think Lewis, Hemingway, Faulkner, and Steinbeck have done to the picture of the United States abroad. Perhaps I ought to drop this line at once, because I'm sure I'll step on many toes and step broadly. But now for the other point. Professor Gregorian says, quite rightly, I think, that anyone who, after Freud, for example, fails to see the irrationality in man is voluntarily blind. I quite agree. But then I am a rationalist. And I think that I'm a rationalist in this sense, not that I think that people are governed by reason. I think some of them are, that all of us are in degree, that by an effort we can be more so. But by rationalism, I mean the view that the world is a system in which every fact and event is connected and intelligibly connected with every other. I wish I had time to argue that point with skeptics in the group, because I know it won't sound in the least convincing when stated just as a generalization. But in general, my answer to Professor Gregorian would be then twofold. I think that we've gone too far in the direction which he quite rightly says should be taken to some distance. We have overemphasized the irrational in man. And secondly, a rationalist philosopher has got to emphasize the strands of intelligibility in the world, so far as he can find them. Now, what's the next question? Yes?
I may be raising the same question as that raised by Dr. Gregorian. I wonder whether your only choices are the choice between sense and nonsense, between reason and unreason. Is there a possibility of sense that is more modest, more self-critical, more conscious of its limitations than the people, than the sense that the people before what you call the elegy?
Yes.
I wonder whether instead of reason, that, as I get it, the reason of the universe reflected in the human mind, what you call the reason, whether in its place you can substitute reason as a method, reason as a way, the only way perhaps, of getting a consensus, of getting people to talk with one another and to create the things to which they can have a common commitment. In other
Yes.
words, can you have rationality within reason?
I think you can. Now, again, I think there are two remarks there. I should agree with what I think is the implication of your remark, that rationality, sense as opposed to nonsense, when we put it, is a matter of degree. There's not a sharp line between them. And I think that sanity is a matter of degree. I think we're all partly insane, some of us a little more near the edge than others, but none of us sane altogether. And then secondly, Bosanquet once said that the solidarity of mankind lies in the intellectual life. And I suppose he's right about that. It's only when we get into the sphere of reason that we can be confident of universal agreement. There's no Chinese multiplication table. There's no Russian algebra as opposed to an American algebra. There is no mathematics or physics that is Indian as distinct from Japanese or French. It is in reason, and even reason at its most abstract, namely logic and mathematics, that the real agreement of mankind is reached. For as a rationalist, what I want to do is to spread that agreement farther and farther down into disciplines that are more and more concrete, because I'm convinced that truth is one. Yes?
Dr. Blanchard, would you disagree that one definition of a rational man is one with a judicious combination or integration of reason, feeling, will, and that there is such a thing as irrational use of reason?
Oh, yes, I should. Now, of course, a merely rational man, well, Russell himself, who is, I suppose, as fine an example of an intellectualist as you could get in the world today, speaks of that inhuman monster, the rational man. And what he meant by that, no doubt, was the person who attempted to solve all his problems by the use of abstract reason. That would be as absurd as to stop at the corner if you're driving a car and try to calculate the velocities and the probable points of impingement of all the cars that are crossing a certain intersection. You would end up in the hands of the police, no doubt at once, and rightly so. No, I think one of the secrets of rationality is to know how irrational, as Professor Gregorian says, we all are. Freud was, I think, really one of the towers of strength for the rationalist, because he did show his therapy was one of the means of restoring us from rescuing us from the very cavemen that he had disclosed in the subcellars of our minds. Yes?
What you just said, Dr. Blanchard, I conclude that it's not unreasonable for a reason to determine reason to come up against the blank wall. This I understood to be the case with some of the existentialists, and not the less honest existentialists.
Yes, well, Kierkegaard, of course, did that. He thought that he saw quite clearly the limits of reason, but he saw them in the wrong place, I think. For example, in ethics, he fairly rubbed his hands in glee when he found a case, the case of Abraham and Isaac in Fear and Trembling, you'll remember it, in which the act which of all possible acts that a human being could do, the deliberate murder of his son, seemed to be commanded by a divine voice. Well, now, what made Kierkegaard so happy about that, apparently, was here was a case in which an unambiguous order to murder came from a divine source. And Abraham was so great a man because he decided to override the protests of his own conscience and reason and follow the divine imperative, his not to reason why, his but to do and let Isaac die. And that seems to me the destruction of ethics altogether. I mean, after all, to take an example which I'm afraid is unfair, Hitler had his intuitions. He had his intuitions to the effect that pacifists, Jews, and socialists should be liquidated. It wasn't, he admitted, a rational intuition, but it was an intuition nevertheless. Now, exactly how is one going to distinguish the Kierkegaardian intuition on the one hand from the Hitlerian intuition on the other? I had a graduate student some time ago at Yale who, in my house, said, now, at any time, somebody, speaking in the presence of one of his friends here, at any time I may get a command which is not based on my own rational reflection or on my own conscience, to throw up my graduate work, to give up the intellectual life, and to go out perhaps to an Oregon lumber camp and pass out soup. If the command comes, I'll go. It didn't come. He went on to a lucrative professorship in philosophy, but I dare say, I don't say that as a criticism. I think he would have gone. But my heart sank when I heard him talk that way, because I thought that in all probability this irrational divine imperative would come from some Freudian subcellar and not from Sinai at all. But how are you going to distinguish the one from the other? Well, now, what other? Yes, way back there.
I'll just ask you another question. One on the poetry part. John Hurst of the Assembly said the only criterion of real great poetry is complexity. And the second part was, what is your opinion on the school of the absurd in literature, which is exactly the essential?
As to complexity, I disagree with Mr. Chardy. I think some of the most beautiful things in the language are the very essence of simplicity. I don't suppose that Gray's elegy, well, perhaps I shouldn't, I know that's not the greatest poetry, but still it is poetry. It's good poetry. I don't think it's very complex. I don't think that little lyric that I read from Haussmann is at all complex. No, I don't think. I think that some great poetry is complex. Some of Browning's is. Some of it's very hard to understand. But in general, to say that complexity is the criterion of great poetry, no. Now about the school of the absurd. That's one of the things I'm protesting against. I don't see why absurdity is a virtue in poetry or in painting any more than philosophy. Now that may indicate a rationalist prejudice on my part. I'm firmly convinced that in philosophy, absurdity is absurdity, that nonsense is nonsense, that nonsense is absurdity, and absurdity nonsense, and that one ought just to rule these things out. But you see, since I hold the principle of sanity, not only in philosophy, but in conduct and even in art, I'm inclined to think that the school of the absurd in art is itself tragic. Well, you know, I went some time ago in London, in rather rapid succession, to two art exhibitions. One, an exhibition of pictures sent from Russia, and the other, an exhibition of the recent work in America. The Russian work was naive. It was old-fashioned. It was simple. Farm hands bringing in the sheaves, portraits of Tolstoy, all that sort of thing. The American work was entirely different. You would have a picture as big as that section of the wall with three great rectangles on it, all alike in different shades of brown, for example. And you were supposed to contemplate that. There were other works that that could be, I think, quite accurately described as magnified Rorschach tests, in which there was no, so far as one could see, no perceptible or intelligible relation between the blobs. You could contemplate them for a long time and not come up with anything at all. There were only two recognizable figures, and things recognized as figures in the whole exhibition. I think both of them were distorted female figures, just barely recognizable as human and as female. Well, I dare say that there are people who, looking at one of these things, fall back in attitudes of a sort of beatific vision and enjoy them and get great delight from them. And I don't want to say that among these people there are not artists who are doing distinguished work. I want merely to say that the cultivation, the deliberate cultivation of absurdity in any branch of art seems to me indefensible. Have we run over the time? I'm afraid we are running over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blanchard.
You're very welcome.